Good afternoon. By now, you should be moving to the cookie portion of this luncheon. Good afternoon. My name is Lisa Mensa. I'm a NASI board member, and I am now at the Aspen Institute, leading the initiative on financial security. And I get the exciting task of moderating the Point-Counterpoint debate on how we should think about the public debt. At Aspen, I had the pleasure of writing with NASI a brief called The Complementary Roles of Social Security and Private Savings. And while we did that last year, it's still available online. And it really sums up to me my life work, which is this conviction that we need both a robust private savings system and a very robust Social Security system in our quest for financial security. And when you are a private savings person, as I am, who understands Social Security as such a vital base, this question of debt keeps being revisited. I am at times so mystified by those who would come at this question of Social Security as just an entitlement question, just a money issue. I'm also mystified at how simply people are ready to dismiss how easy it is to change this. I was inspired by a quote that Nancy Altman made this year at one of our NASI briefings, that Social Security's income and assets should never be part of any broad deficit reduction effort. Diverting these funds from their intended purposes is actually morally wrong, and it's illegal. So I find it so interesting that the entitlements questions are with us so often. These questions of how do we pay, they are in fact vital. I think in today's debate, we're going to get a flavor of whether these are really political questions or economic questions. In the wonk world, people who are in this room, this debate doesn't get any better than bringing Brad DeLong and Maya MacGuineas together. For us today, and for this purpose of this debate, the number 60 is not just about a filibuster-proof majority, but it is a quest of, should this in fact be the percent of GDP that our public debt reaches? So we're going to talk about a different 60 in this session. So many of you know Brad and Maya, and I have the pleasure of having worked with Maya on a former NASI panel and having just met Brad. Brad is a professor of economics at UC Berkeley, the chair of the Political Economy and Industrial Society. No, wait a minute. No. That's the wrong note. Sorry, Brad. Brad comes to us by way of the red eye, so we are particularly thankful for your travels to be with us today. Maya is the director of fiscal policy at the New America Foundation and is also the president of the Committee for a Responsible Budget. Their full bios, not the one I mangle, can be found in your conference folders. We're going to do something a little different. This is not the traditional NASI session where we are presented just with charts and graphs and then we calmly get a chance to ask questions. We're going to try to have this session as a debate. I will try to moderate lightly and leave Brad and Maya to really present their sense of this main question of how should we think about the public debt. The way it's going to work, Brad is going to have the opening remarks, and then he'll be followed by Maya. And then we're going to go back to a more point-counterpoint, allowing both of them some time to go back and forth. And we have 45 minutes for that, maybe a wee bit less. And I am really looking forward to that. I can't imagine a better topic for ourselves this morning. So with no further ado, I'm going to turn the podium over to Brad. Thank you, Brad.
Okay. Thank you very much. Let me start with background. In June 2007, the S&P composite was at 1,500, and a 10-year 5% coupon $1,000 U.S. Treasury bond sold for $990. By March 2009, should move over here. By March 2009, the S&P was at 800, and 10-year 5% coupon bonds would have sold for $1,170. This great wheeling of asset prices, a 45% cumulative loss on risky equity and a 23% cumulative gain on safe nominal debt, Is a collapse in the risk tolerance of financial markets a grand flight to safety, as nearly everybody tried to dump the risky parts of their portfolios and scramble into safe assets of a magnitude we have not seen since and possibly exceeds that of the Great Depression? Now, such large movements in asset prices matter. Financial markets send the real economy signals, and in this case the signals they are sending is that all risky investments should be avoided and all risky organizations should be shrunk. And since everything private sector is in some sense risky, the firms of the real economy responded by firing people, which is where we are now. Now, since at least 1825, when Britain's canal speculation-driven bubble collapsed, and when First Lord of the Treasury Robert Banks Jenkinson begged the Bank of England governor to do something, governments have responded. Households feel poor and stop spending, and businesses stop investing and shrink operations because risky asset prices have collapsed as investors scramble for safety. The government then tries to fix the situation in the short run by making more safe assets and by expanding the demands for risky ones, by guaranteeing private debt, thus turning risky assets into safe ones, by nationalizing troubled institutions to turn dodgy liabilities into gilt-edged ones, by buying risky assets for cash, by reducing the demand for safe assets, by eliminating expectations of deflation, by printing up a huge extra honking tranche of new safe assets, government bonds, by bringing forward in time government spending, and by postponing taxes. This is the drill. This has been the drill since 1825. Now, there are limits to all of these short-term stimulative policies. The feckless bankers who caused the problem in the first place have leveraged positions in risky assets, and they benefit enormously from policies that raise their prices. Knowledge that there was a Bernanke put last time will encourage future irrational exuberance. Governments that buy up so many assets that they own banks and companies are unlikely to run them well. If too many risky assets are generated, the central bank then faces the task of somehow withdrawing them before we replace our depression problem with an inflation one. The huge honking tranches of bonds printed up have to be amortized, and those taxes are a drag. And if you print up so many extra bonds, if you run such huge deficits that you crack the Treasury's bond status as safe asset, then you haven't raised but reduced the supply of safe assets and have made the situation worse. With all that as background, I have two things to say. First, we need bigger deficits now. Unemployment is at 10%. The U.S. government can borrow for 30 years at an expected real rate of 2.12% per year, while leaving bondholders holding 100% of inflation risk. Over the past 30 months, the private market has swallowed an extra $2.9 trillion in U.S. Treasury debt, from $4.9 to $7.8 trillion, without that extra debt having moved Treasury interest rates up at all. Commit $1 of real cash flow to debt amortization, and you can raise $40 today if you're the U.S. government selling into the Treasury market, and only $15 if you're an S&P 500 company. If you have any trust in price signals at all, right now they are yelling us that the government should be raising more money on financial markets and spending it to put people to work. And there is no sign in financial markets that we're close to the edge of America's debt capacity. There were such signs back in 1992. There aren't any now. And our reserve army of the unemployed right now is larger than the U.S. armed forces at their World War II peak. So that's point one. Now point two, which is the negation of point one. We need smaller deficits later for a value of later equal to soon, as in before 2015. CBPP wants to stabilize the debt-to-GDP ratio in normal times, but that's not good enough. We need the debt capacity to run large deficits in extraordinary times, in World Wars II, in Marshall Plans, in bribing the Chinese to build nuclear rather than coal-fired greenhouse gas-emitting power plants, in paying to move the entire population of Bangladesh to Alberta and build them places to live there, so they don't all drown in a global warming-induced typhoon, which will turn the survivors into suicide bombers who'll come after us for our carbon emissions. If your debt-to-GDP ratio is stable in normal times, you don't have the capacity to respond in abnormal times, and abnormal times will come. So aiming at stabilizing the debt to GDP ratio is not enough. Now, getting smaller deficits later, for later equals soon, is going to be very hard. That America needs to make two political decisions. How large a social insurance state do we want to have? And how do we want to get reasonable value for that portion of our healthcare system that is financed by the government? And if we don't collectively make these decisions, global capital markets will at some point say we're out of time and will make those decisions for us in ways that none of us will like. And for 30 years, we have by and large been unable to make these decisions. Our governance structure has been broken. The unbalanced Reagan as opposed to Ford Republicans, some thinking that large unfunded tax cuts would force spending discipline, some thinking that they would unleash a huge economic boom, rather more thinking it would get them jobs and après nous le deluge. The round-the-bend Gingrich as opposed to Darman Republicans, who developed the strategy of create gridlock and blame the other party and ride it to power, which both parties have been trying to use during the past decade. The Republicans, it looks like, with considerably more success. And now, as a health care bill that is Mitt Romney's plan, right? Republican Governor Mitt Romney's plan for Massachusetts is the Senate health care bill, but moved to the right. Less public involvement in service delivery and some huge honking prospective Medicare cuts in the out years, as Mitt Romney's plan for health care reform attracts 0 Republican votes. Now we have simply a problem with Republicans, for there is no longer any sane faction in either Republican caucus that I can see. And this is really bad, right? At the moment, our healthcare system spends twice as much as other countries for worse outcomes. We have a 6.9% of GDP CBO baseline fiscal gap, and virtually everyone expects the members of Congress to decry our fiscal future and then turn around and vote overwhelmingly to reject PAYGO and increase the fiscal gap yet again by another 2.5 percentage points. The DOC fix, the AMT fix, the R&D tax credit, the middle-class tax cut that seems to play the same role in the aftermath of every presidential inauguration that the grant of solidi to the Praetorian Guards played during the downfall of the Roman Empire. If we hadn't had George W. Bush installed as president by a vote of 5-4, of our fiscal gap, right, 1.2% is Medicare Part D, enacted in those days when, as Senator Hatch says, it was customary not to pay for things. 1.4% is to amortize Bush-era deficits. 0.7% for the expansion of a military. The Air Force portion, at least, appears to increase rather than reduce the number of recruits to Al-Qaeda. I sometimes want to close my eyes, tap my heels together 3 times, and say, there's no president like Gore, open them, and be back on the planet where I really live, in which we have a 3.6% of GDP fiscal gap, are at the edge of a stable debt to GDP ratio, and Joe Lieberman is president. We need to climb out of this box, and I don't know how we're going to, and I have already talked too long. So I am going to stop, and I am going to demand that Maya come up with sensible, possible, effective institutional reforms and policy initiatives.
Right. Well, thank you so much, Brad. That seems like a very fair way to kick off a debate. You should be no problem. But I'm going to start with a story, which you know the first part of. But this is a story that reminds you to be humble and to know that your kids are always listening, and this is a true story. So a couple of weeks ago, I guess my husband said, what's going on at work? And I said, oh, I'm doing this, this, this. Oh, and I'm going to do a debate with Brad DeLong on whether the debt matters. And he said, ooh, you're going to get your ass kicked, which is, you know, the kind of cozy dinner conversation everyone loves to have. And my kids were there, but I didn't think anything of it. They're 3, 4, and 5. Anyhow, I reminded him that that was one of the things I was doing today, and so I'm leaving to the office early this morning. I'm not driving my kids to school this morning because I needed to get to work early, so I open the door. All our neighbors are around, dropping their kids off at the bus, and my son, who I mean, he's 5, just waves, "Bye-bye, Mommy, have a great day, have fun getting your ass kicked by Brad DeLong." So, you're a cult hero in our house. So here goes. All right, so where I will start, I mean, there's very little of what was just said that I disagree with. Somebody who runs a group, the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget, clearly I worry about the debt, and we worry about it more now than ever, in recent years certainly. In the past, we focused a lot on the long-term fiscal problems, the long-term fiscal gap, the things that we know are driven by aging and growing healthcare costs. And we had not a whole lot of time, but the luxury of time was on our side, that we could move slowly, phase changes in gradually, and still get ahead of these problems, even though every year that we delayed, it became a little bit more troubling and worrisome that sort of the political process is not set up to deal with these. But more recently, as a result of many things, deficits that we ran during the expansionary period, the effects of the recession, the costs that we incurred to deal with the recession, and now policies that are supported by both the White House and both houses of Congress, which would extend current policies without offsetting the costs, we are headed towards a debt that is clearly on an unsustainable path. We are moving quickly towards 60%. We'll be at 80 to 100% by the end of the decade. We're moving towards unprecedented debt territories for any time other than war and beyond if we don't make changes. So we need to start worrying about the debt immediately, because the path we are on will not allow us to continue. At some point, we will bump into a fiscal crisis or a deteriorating economic climate due to the excessive borrowing. That does not mean that we need to start reducing the debt immediately. We are still straddling very much the two tensions of how to enable an economic recovery to take hold and how to enter into a period of fiscal consolidation without derailing that economic recovery, but aggressively and early enough that we can keep credit markets confident in our ability. Like Brad just pointed out, if you look at interest rates now, there's nothing to worry about. But there will be at some point, and not one of us can figure out at what point that is. One of the things about sort of where the twin goals of economic recovery and deficit reduction is that, again, as somebody who runs the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget, many people in the press, many groups sort of expected that I or other kind of fiscal scolds, as we're called, would be yelling about deficits of $1.4 trillion last year and something along those lines this year. And I'd get calls from the media all the time. What do you think about these appalling deficits? Well, of course they were appalling. But and I don't speak for my entire board, because my board of directors, that is sort of the leading budget experts who run OMB and CBO and the Fed and the budget committees, we're very divided on whether we should have a stimulus or the effectiveness of the stimulus. So I'll speak for myself personally. I thought the stimulus was absolutely in order. I was terrified of where we were headed economically. I thought all the borrowing that we entered into, while not targeted perfectly, was the right thing to do to err on the side of caution. And I still think that we're there. I wouldn't rush out of that. I'm still worried about a double-dip recession as much as I'm worried about a fiscal crisis. They both keep me awake at night. But it doesn't mean that we don't have to put something in place now to get ahead of this. So while I didn't worry about $1 trillion deficits in the immediate term, I certainly worry that they're not on the path to move to the debt coming back down. What I do think we need to do is put a plan in place immediately to restore financial markets and buy ourselves some time so that we continue with expansionary policies in the very short run and then move to debt stabilization, deficit consolidation quickly. Recently, we just enacted something called the Announcement Effect Club. For those of you who read Greg Mankiw's blog and know about the Pagoo Club that calls out people in a good way who are supporting energy taxes, we decided to start keeping a list of everybody who is calling for putting in place some kind of deficit reduction plan immediately, but allowing it to take place gradually, which I really think is the right model here. It also happens to have the political advantage that politicians can make some hard choices now, but they can phase them in a little, at least after the midterms, a little bit more slowly. So, Brad is right, of course, that borrowing is cheap right now, but it would be absolutely impossible to predict when that would change, and we don't want to find out. So, as the warnings keep popping up more and more regularly from Fitch, from the rating agencies, from the IMF to the Chinese government, and we see what's going on in over-leveraged countries around the world, it seems to me that that's almost replacing financial markets. They, for some reason, are blind and focused on the short term, but you're hearing all sorts of outside experts warning that this is now the time to start focusing on this. And you're also having a lot of outside groups that have been coming out with reports and plans. Recently, the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities came out with one. We came out with one, which I'll talk about in just a second. The MacArthur Foundation with NAPA and National Academy of Sciences, came out with a report. All of them saying we need to focus on the debt. So you're starting to hear a real choir of stabilizing the debt at some point is important. And Brad points out that you have to do more than stabilize that. And just this morning I was at a hearing where we discussed what's the right level. Because one of the important things to recognize is that we entered this economic downturn in a period of actual fiscal strength. Even though we were running deficits, our debt was quite low. And so we had the fiscal flexibility to respond as needed. We now would not be in that same situation again. We were around 40% before. We'll now be at 60%, headed toward 80%. If we get hit with another crisis, and if there's one thing we all know is you never know when that will happen, we'll be much less able to respond effectively. So not only do we need to stabilize the debt, we need to bring it down to a reasonable level at which to stabilize it. So let me just talk a little bit about this report that we issued called Red Ink Rising. We recommended a 6-step proposal to stabilizing the debt, and I'll just quickly mention what those steps are. The first would be to commit immediately to a plan to stabilize the debt at 60% of GDP in the year 2018. Now, there's nothing magic about that number. What we tried to do is find a number that's an international benchmark, a time period that's reasonable to allow economic recovery, but also to reassure markets. Would we be unhappy if it were a little bit less or a little bit more? We would be thrilled if any member of Congress were seriously talking about any plan to stabilize the debt. So this is a way to start the discussion. Second, we say that you should develop a specific and credible plan in this year. You need to put it in place, not just commit to it, but fill out the specifics immediately. Then, given economic situation right now, we recommend starting to phase in deficit reduction, moving towards stabilizing the debt in the year 2012. We would include debt targets, our annual debt targets, and a trigger mechanism to make sure that Congress stays on track. In the year 2018, we'd hope for the debt to be stabilized. And then, actually, at 60%, that's not low enough. Given that historical levels are below 40%, we would recommend more gradually we move back down towards historical levels. I think one thing, so the folks at CBPP today were saying, well, that's a pretty aggressive goal. One thing we noticed when we were working out this proposal, and again, there's no one right number, but you actually, if you look at, this is a group that knows baselines, if you look at the current law baseline, our deficits are actually higher than current law until the year 2015. We are working off a more realistic baseline, assuming Congress is moving ahead with extending tax cuts, AMT fix, these types of things. But one of the lessons when you start running the numbers is if you work off of current law, if you extend all these policies and don't offset the costs, we make the fiscal challenge ahead of us so much harder. That's policymakers' choice, but they have to understand how much harder that makes things if that's the point they decide to enter with. Okay, so second, when we get to policies, that's when everybody gets vague. So I will take the DeLong challenge and I will throw out a couple specifics just to keep the conversation rich and exciting. There are 3 things that I think should clearly be on the table. I kind of look at them as low-hanging fruit. One of them is we should be raising the retirement age. A second one of them is that we should be talking about new revenues have to be part of this. The new revenue source that I would look at would be an energy tax. There are plenty of others, but I think an energy tax makes sense because of energy policy, environmental policy, and revenue policies. A third would be tax expenditure reform. We have nearly $1 trillion basically in lost revenues running through the budget. Spending runs through the tax code. It's not a good way to do policy. And then at the risk of getting lunch, is everyone's lunch cleared? Right, it's cleared. So getting lunch thrown at me at a NASI conference, I'm a big supporter of means testing. I think that when you look at social insurance, we're going to have to reform social insurance to target it and focus it at people more in need and slow the growth of benefits for people less in need. I know that will be controversial here, and that will keep things interesting. Just not to give other areas of the budget a free pass, one of the things that you see is that if you slow the growth of domestic discretionary spending or freeze it, you can actually get a lot of savings. Yes, the problem in the budget comes from aging and health care, and that's where we should focus, but domestic discretionary should not be left unchecked. Everything has to be on the table. It's going to be important to think about policies that are conducive to economic growth. That's not going to get us out of this situation, but you'd rather have tax reform that's not bad for the economy, that's good for the economy, same with spending. And in that vein, I think that we should be looking at refocusing much of our budget spending away from consumption-oriented to the underinvestment in the budget, where I think there are many areas that need more spending. So I will stop there and look forward to the discussion.
Maya has put a lot on the table, and she took your challenge and gave us, I think, I heard 5 ideas, not just 3. But please, your turn.
Well, I suppose that the right thing to talk about right now is what's going on at the other end of Pennsylvania Avenue as we're sitting here, which is the falling apart of a health care reform proposal that was, as I said, the signature initiative of the Republican governor of Massachusetts back when he was trying to position himself as a moderate, middle-of-the-road Republican who could work with both parties, as opposed to the somewhat crazy right-wing creature that emerged during the 2008 primaries. That the kind of essentially Mitt Romney's signature health care initiative, coupled with substantial out-year Medicare cuts, or at least processes that would be likely to lead in some way to Medicare cuts. That, as longtime Mitt Romney advisor John Gruber of MIT says, every idea that has ever been proposed to bend the curve of Medicare costs is in there. Surely not all of them will work, but it is highly likely that some of them will. And if you see something that isn't part of the current debate about the long-run debt and the long-run deficit, it's the idea that taking steps to try to get health care spending costs under control, and taking those steps now, and sweetening the deal by promising that we're going to move toward universal coverage and insurance market reforms as part of the plan to try to get Medicare costs on a more sensible long-term trajectory. That should be at the focus of the long-term debt and deficit debate, and it isn't. And it's not because, say, Republican senators are necessarily opposed to spending money on health care. Collins, Domenici, Grassley, Hatch, Snow, Specter, Voinovich, all were extremely happy, right, to vote for Medicare Part B. But when the chips are down and when it's a Democratic initiative that promises to spend more money on health care in the short run and to probably cut Medicare costs in the long run, all of a sudden that has to be pushed out of the debt and deficit frame. And instead you want to hold press conferences about how important it is to establish a commission. So I don't see where the votes on the Republican side for any realistic plan to try to bring the debt and deficit under control are. I haven't seen where those votes are since the kind of first George H.W. Bush administration. And without those Republican votes, without any Republican votes, the task is going to be impossible. Right? That there is a fairly strong long-term deficit hawk Rubinite faction within the Democratic Party. And at the moment, right, Tim Geithner and Larry Summers and Rahm Emanuel are trying to hold off the Democratic left with their whips and their chairs with some success. But they can't carry the burden indefinitely. And so I think we need a new and very different Republican Party, or we're going to wind up going down the road to a place we won't like at all. And I really don't know how to get there.
Maya, your response, I'm curious if you can pick up on Brad's 2 things. First, your remedies didn't involve health care. And second, he puts the emphasis on where are the votes in the Republican Party and ends on a rather political note. Can you pick up on that?
Well, that's easy. I would start with that the political environment is such that I am utterly discouraged, depressed, and I don't see how we're going to get this done. As a political independent, and I think no matter what party you're in, I think everybody sees there's plenty of blame to go all around. One of the problems is that sort of being fiscally responsible tends to be something the minority party does, not because they're so committed to it. It's not their passion as it is mine and 4 other people's in the world. It's not the hottest topic. But, it's defense. It's a game of keeping other people from the party in power from getting their agenda enacted. And that's troubling, but that's not the, and I tend to be somebody who just doesn't understand the political system. It's probably naive, but I just look at sort of the governance of this country, and I can't imagine why we would set it up as an adversarial system. There's no way that that seems like a good model. But it's still much worse than it's ever been, and I see the lesson, every political lesson that we see, including the Massachusetts election, is just going to be to make that more so. And so I think we're desperately struggling for any fake mechanisms to be able to jumpstart the process. And none of them are perfect. We can talk all about a commission, whether that's a good or a bad idea, but that's what that is. It's a mechanism to say regular order is not functioning very well, so can we jumpstart that? You know, I've always sort of liked the model of the gang of, whether it's 16 or 2 or whatever, starting bipartisan discussions of things. But right now the pressure from the two parties is such that that's really frowned upon. I don't see any real bipartisan efforts getting specific on policies. Perhaps there can be some very, very slow starts, like bipartisan efforts to pick a fiscal goal. I mean, I do think sort of stabilizing the debt wherever and whenever you want to isn't a partisan goal. If you could get people to agree that we need a fiscal goal, then we can start getting a little bit more specific. Some kind of a promise, and this is probably harder, but from politicians, not to promise not to do things. I mean, I think the fact that we have the promise not to raise taxes and the almost as impossible to get promise not to raise taxes on people making less than $250,000 a year, these promises don't make any sense. You need a bunch of politicians saying, I might not want to raise taxes, but I'm not going to take anything off the table. Some kind of group where you just allow the discussion to begin. But this is grasping at straws, I would say. When it comes to health care, and it's such a, I mean, there are two really tense topics right now, health care and commissions. But, you know, health care is a tough one. And again, my board's really divided on whether at this point what it looks like is something that we want to see go forward or not. I think the first priority has to make sure that the economic recovery sticks. The second priority has to be fiscal issues. And the third priority can be other priorities, whether it's expanding health insurance or cutting corporate taxes or anything else that, you know, could be good things, spending more on investment in the next generation. Now, health care could, I think there's a very strong case that health care can be not just a part of the solution, but the biggest part of the solution. And that argument is you put all these things that are in the bill and you use the expansion to some form of universal or moving towards universal health care as the sweetener. The problem in my mind is that the sweetener is dwarfing the reforms. I don't look at the estimates, and nobody knows precisely what the savings will be, but I always defer to my favorite government program in the world, which is CBO, and CBO says that the savings would likely, the Senate bill would likely be 1/4 to 1/2% of GDP. So given the size of the problem, that's not enough. I mean, I think we had to go farther on the savings and maybe have the sweetener be smaller in order for this really to be a fiscal package. As it stands, we know we'll have to do so much more on health care. And for every dollar that we don't get out of health care, it's going to come out of another part of the budget, whether that's Social Security or domestic discretionary or defense or taxes. And there's a lot more to be done in health care. And I do worry that if you pass something that isn't as aggressive, it seems to me it's easier to pass those cost-saving measures in this bill now, where there is a big sweetener, than later. So I sure would like to see a way to pull more things in. And I would have, you know, watching the political process kind of negotiate down is discouraging, but there's almost not a single policy expert who doesn't think we need to reform the employer-provided health care tax expenditure. And the problem is, once a sensible idea gets put out into the political arena where the debate is a heated one, it becomes toxic. And so a excellent idea that is supported by experts on both sides of the aisle is now something that you can't touch, and you have to kind of dress it up as something else and scale it back, and, you know, sooner or later you lose all the good ideas. So I couldn't, I know it's a debate, I couldn't agree more that the political process is, it's just horribly ill-equipped to deal with this right now, and it seems to be moving in the wrong direction. You know, you always come back, there are a couple things that come back in these discussions. One, we need some kind of a fiscal crisis, but not a real one. Like, how could we manufacture a fake fiscal crisis to wake people up? And the second one is always, who's going to be the next Ross Perot? Who's going to be the person who runs? Because I think the public is starting to care about the issue. It's moving up in their mind. Now, when you get specific about what you have to do to fix it, not so easy to convince a group of people that they really love all those ideas. But it's certainly issue that's resonating with the public more, but you probably need a politician who really puts it on the agenda, and you have people from both parties fighting to be politically responsible. We'll see if that happens in the midterms. I don't know.
Maya, to get Brad to respond, what's the question you want to ask Brad?
Well, I mean, he made me sort of solve the budget problem, so obviously before the 45 minutes is over, he has to also. That's only fair. But I'm also interested, because I really am interested in this question of how we should look at the right fiscal goal. And again, I do not think there's a single number or a single time frame, and I think the real goal here is just to find the balance that you can get people to commit to. But Brad is a brilliant economist. How would you think about picking the right fiscal goal?
Well, I think the right fiscal goal is that in normal times you have to do significantly better than a stable debt-to-GDP ratio. Right? That's saying that we could run a 3.6% of GDP annual deficit and stabilize debt to GDP at 60%. That's not going to be good enough because there are going to be times when we'll want to do more to react to emergencies, and we need kind of the debt capacity to do so. The Rubinite view was that you wanted to aim for budget balance on the non-Social Security part of the budget because we did know that we had this baby boom generation moving through the social insurance system, and we didn't want to ignore the fact that that was going to come and bite us at some point over the next 40 years. That seemed to me to be a very good goal for the 1990s. And one that, in fact, we attained, and one that we might still be at, if only there hadn't been this nice little 5-4 vote back in 2000. Now, kind of running budget surpluses equal to running a budget surplus equal to the net Social Security revenue is no longer an attainable target, anyone thinks. And at any rate, the time during which the Greenspan Commission Social Security taxes were supposed to have been piling themselves up in order to do the appropriate tax smoothing, that time is now gone. We've spent that over the past 30 years. And so I would be extremely happy to simply get to a stable debt-to-GDP ratio, to say stabilize the debt-to-GDP ratio and declare that to be a victory, and then pick up the following day and say, but that's not good enough. We need to not have the federal government be such a drain on capital formation. We need to do more in order to push the debt-to-GDP ratio down so we have the tax capacity to actually respond to emergencies. But trying to stabilize the debt-to-GDP ratio in the medium run is a target that might someday, by some miracle, become politically attainable. And I'm happy to sign on to that, but I reserve the right to then ask for more once that shows up.
Brad, in making some final remarks from your side, when you say reach a stable, what's the how of that? This is a session to think about the public debt. Even if you give us a goal of 3.6, what's the how of that? How do you think about that? How is that reached?
Well, I think first thing we should do is we should pass a health care reform bill that does allow the Medicare Commission to require that Congress vote up or down on its recommendations with majority votes. And we need to do everything we can to try to improve the efficiency of the health care system. And then we need to give the Commissioner of Social Security the power to raise taxes and cut benefits within a limited range if the Social Security system is out of long-run fiscal balance, because certainly the Congress won't do what's necessary. And so just as Congress has delegated its power to coin money and regulate the value thereof to the Federal Reserve, so the Congress should, within limits, delegate its power to set Social Security contribution and benefit rates to the actuaries on the grounds that they can't. No, they can hardly do worse.
Jump the shark.
Right? They can hardly do worse.
What do you think, Mr. Former Commissioner?
And then if that reaches the end, if that's enough, then we have to put on a value-added tax in order to provide us with an additional revenue stream to get us there. And all of these are things to do over the next 10 to 20 years. But none of these things will be done unless politicians are, well, who was it? The Emperor Augustus's great-grandnephew, the Caesar Caligula, had a motto, Oderant Demetuant, which is properly translated as, I don't care if they like me as long as they're scared of me. Actually, it's let them hate, right, as long as they fear. And, the members of Congress, right, they really don't fear us, right, at all. It's John Elwood, one of my colleagues at Berkeley, sat me down one lunch and actually gave me a lecture about how I was protesting about Senator Domenici, right, who I'd been in a bunch of meetings with when I was at the Treasury, and who was a very reasonable guy, and who very nice conversations about the importance of a sound fiscal posture, how first and foremost the government must live before its means and have the means whereby to live. And then he'd go out and talk to his base, where he'd say the solution to the deficit is to cut taxes, to starve the beast, to unleash the magic of the supply side and let the revenues roll down like a mighty river. And I would say, oh, he's just pandering. I know what he really thinks, right? When the time is right, he'll vote the right way. And Medicare Part D, the 2001 tax cut, the 2003 tax cut, the 2001 tax cut, even though Alan Greenspan was out there saying this thing needs a trigger, right? This is bad public policy without a trigger. And there was Domenici in there voting for it, and here I was asking John Elwood why. And so Elwood looked at me and said, Brad, your problem is that you think you're in on the con. That you think that he's pandering when he talks to the base, and he's telling what he really thinks when he talks to you. He isn't. He's telling what he thinks when he talks to the base. He's pandering when he talks to you. And there is no surer way to con yourself than to think that you are in on the con. And so until and unless you recognize that they regard you as the kind of unreasonable single interest group voter who has to be soothed and calmed with words before they then go out and, in the words of Jesse Unruh, do the voting against you, that you have to do if you want to intervene in politics, that you have to understand. Now, how to make senators and congressmen and candidates scared of the collective deficit, sensible deficit hawk, a government that doesn't destroy itself by living beyond its means community, is a very hard task. But one way to start is to not let them get away with BS. That is, when Senator Voinovich goes to talk to Barack Obama and says it's really important to have a deficit commission. We need to do something. We need to get rid of our huge problems, and normal order doesn't work. Well, all of us should be out there calling up every single reporter we know, saying, this is Senator, I voted for the 2001 tax cut. I voted for Medicare Part D Voinovich. For him to dress himself up in the feathers of a deficit hawk rather than a deficit pigeon, a deficit chicken, a deficit turkey vulture, I don't know what. That what's he really saying? Stop me before I legislate again? It's the arsonist saying, put me in charge of the fire department and I'll put it out. And until we're willing to call people on this, and for the past decade it's been overwhelmingly the Republican caucus, they won't fear us, right? There won't be any metuant there. And so we won't get anywhere.
Brad, thank you. Maya, last word?
Well, just a Voinovich point, because it's interesting. You see those examples all the time, but that's sort of the opposite point of that I would make, which is I want to give anybody who's willing to stand up against their party and make some hard choices credit when they do. No, and Voinovich he was the one Republican who cast the vote for increasing the debt ceiling enough to talk about whether there should be a commission. Or he's one of the few Republican senators, just a handful, who supported two-sided pay-go, which would mean that tax cuts had to be offset rather than not. I think when you go against your party and make a hard choice, so if Republicans willing to talk about including taxes in the mix or Democrats willing to talk about being more aggressive on spending, I look at that as something that needs to be responded to positively. But that's not my main point. My main point is that I can put out a budget plan that would stabilize the debt at the goal that we're putting out or a different kind of goal, but it's brutal. I mean, we're in that big a fiscal mess, and it's going to take really big policy changes. And you go up to the Hill, and there's just no way that this is a political environment that's ready to deal with this at all. So I leave my job quite depressed every day. And I guess I feel like we have to look for different kinds of mechanisms that are going to help. And the kinds of things that I think about, and none of these are perfect. I mean, none of these are even great. But I'm sort of interested in an idea of whether there could be some kind of fiscal advisory board for the country. So something that's not making decisions. I wouldn't give the power to the Social Security Commissioner. That seems a little bit extreme to me. But I would create a board that said, in this economic environment, this is the kind of the level of stimulus we recommend, or this is the fiscal goal that we recommend. So sort of like CBO has expert advisors. I'd like the country to have some expert advisors who weigh in on these things. The second idea is looking more at automatic policy changes, so triggers, things that would basically say, Congress, if you're not going to make the hard choices, these things will happen automatically. So that's something we've explored a little bit in our report. They're hard to craft the right way, but I'm intrigued by them. And then finally, political reform. I look at redistricting as one of the political reforms that's just going to have to be a piece of this, because until people are in competitive districts, I worry about them being able to work together. But at the end of the day, other than some really hard policy choices that I, as a non-elected official, even know how hard they are, I don't know how we're going to get out of this mess. I do know we need to be worrying about it now. Thank you, Lisa.
Maya and Brad, as promised, we have the most exciting session, although there are some great ones to come. I want to just thank you very, very much for helping us think differently about the public.